Unreal Engine 5. If you've paid any amount of attention to the world of video games over the past couple years, you've most likely heard these terms, yet the potential has primarily existed in the form of demonstrations and promises. Countless developers have since pledged allegiance to Epic's latest iteration of Unreal Engine, but its possibilities have yet to be truly realized. That is, until now. Using its popular Fortnite Battle Royale title as a vehicle for showcasing the engine's new capabilities, the latest chapter finally delivers on these promises by introducing the full suite of Unreal Engine 5's features across a new generation of consoles and the PC. What you're seeing now is Fortnite running on a console at 60 frames per second, harnessing the power of Lumen's fully dynamic global illumination and reflection system, in combination with unprecedented detail made possible through Nanite. Over the course of this video, we'll demonstrate the benefits of these technologies in action, and see how it transforms Fortnite from a game that looks like this, to one that looks like this instead. Along the way, we'll test and benchmark all the various platforms on which these new technologies are supported, including the Xbox Series S. And of course, Alex Battaglia will join me to share his insights on this new technology. So, let us begin. Since its reveal more than 2 years ago, we've been anxiously awaiting the arrival of the first Unreal Engine 5 driven games utilizing its key new technologies. While UE5 itself has been integrated into Fortnite already, it's only with the arrival of this new chapter that Lumen, Nanite, virtual shadow maps, temporal super resolution, and more have been integrated into the game. That means if you're playing Fortnite on Xbox Series X, Series S, the PS5, or PC, you now have access to these new technologies, at least when using the 60 frames per second mode, as they are disabled at 120. Before we dive into platform comparisons, however, I'd like to first showcase and discuss the benefits of these new technologies and how they apply to Fortnite. The star of the show, at least in my eyes, is Lumen, which introduces ray-traced reflections and fully real-time global illumination. The modeling of light has remained a key challenge in real-time graphics rendering since their inception. For years, developers relied on a variety of pre-calculated solutions for lighting, which vary according to the needs of the game. Fortnite, however, features a fully dynamic time of day system, meaning that the sun position is constantly changing as you play. There are solutions to handle time of day cycles, of course, but these methods have significant limitations, which can be seen in all prior versions of Fortnite. Real-time ray tracing represents a step forward in this regard. It now models the behavior of light within a scene. When light enters through a door or window, it now bounces around the room, correctly illuminating the surroundings. This is the basis on which Lumen works, the main difference being that when using software Lumen, as is the case on the consoles, the scene into which rays are traced are simplified using a mix of distance fields and screen space tracing. Hardware accelerated Lumen, however, traces triangles as opposed to a simplified distance field. Now, we've seen hardware accelerated Lumen used on consoles with the Matrix Awakens demo from last year, but hitting 60 frames per second means sacrificing this feature, so all skinned meshes, such as characters, are reflected using screen space calculations only. PC users retain the option to use hardware Lumen, of course, but we'll discuss that in more detail later in the video. Now, to showcase the benefits of Lumen, we can utilize the console version of the game. The left scene here was captured using its 60 frames per second mode on PlayStation 5, while the right was captured using the 120Hz mode instead, which disables Lumen and Nanite entirely, falling back on existing methods featured previously in the game. Right away, the difference should be clear. Sunlight now pours into interior spaces, simulating proper bounce lighting with full color transfer. Natural contact shadows are formed around objects, producing a more coherent and visually pleasing result. This underpass is a dramatic example. Rays of light pouring into this confined space, the color of the earth can be observed bouncing across the originally gray cement of the bridge itself, filling this area with beautiful, vibrant colors. The same can be observed in this fine slap juice establishment. Sunlight once again pours in through the large windows adorning the front of the shop, bouncing off the wooden floor and illuminating the entire space with a stunning orange glow. I think it's fair to say that even without understanding the underlying principles of light, every player should be able to instantly recognize these benefits from simply playing the game. It's that effective. In this scene then, with Lumen enabled, the area above the player on this porch is indirectly lit, crevices exhibit gentle shadows, the orange paint subtly lends its color to the supporting structure, and everything just feels more grounded, doesn't it? Now in comparison without Lumen, the wooden structure above the player basically appears to float with no ambient shadowing or light filling in the space properly. It just looks bland. But that doesn't mean the game looked bad with rasterized lighting. It can still produce beautiful results. In this scene, for instance, there's a visible difference to be sure, but it still looks perfectly fine on the right, I think. Basically, Lumen Global Illumination simply ensures that the lighting always feels more accurate and beautiful, even in the many, many edge cases throughout the world. It's all about consistency and realism. Reflections are of course important when it comes to creating surface realism, like in this scene. Note how the orange pillar can be observed reflecting within this countertop surface. This could of course be faked to some degree, but would require special attention when using rasterization. With Lumen, once the material properties are configured, it basically just works. And it can apply to any objects of any shape or size, while still obeying the properties of light transport. That's the key here. Of course, this is an expensive process, and one of the ways in which the team has managed to reach 60 frames per second in consoles is by reducing the number of rays per pixel to 1/16. As a result, they lean heavily on the denoising algorithm to create a more coherent result. It creates a visible shimmering in more challenging situations like this, but I do feel is well worth the trade-off, while still targeting these higher frame rates. Prior to the release of this update, we've expressed concerns multiple times regarding the capabilities of the new consoles when it comes to hitting 60 frames per second while taking advantage of Unreal Engine 5's new features. Fortnite now serves as basically a demonstration that it is indeed possible. So basically, with Lumen, the world of Fortnite truly comes to life, sometimes resembling offline CG renders, but it's not the only feature on display, of course. Nanite virtualized geometry also makes its debut in Fortnite. We've discussed this at length in the past, but essentially Nanite enables a high level of geometric detail on Nanite-enabled static meshes, which is both more efficient and higher quality in terms of rendering. The initial version of Unreal Engine 5 did not support alpha masked textures, which were typically used to render foliage, such as grass and trees. With Unreal 5.1, however, this feature has been added. Yet in the case of Fortnite, despite the copious amount of foliage, it doesn't actually make use of this feature at all. Instead, every tree within the game world uses triangles like the rest of the scenery. Yep, each tree, bush, and blade of grass is now a nanite polygon mesh. Now, according to Epic, there is some tweaking that's been done to the nanite autolods to avoid the perception of losing mass based on distance. That is, the trees remain visually consistent regardless of distance from the camera, like the rest of the nanite geometry. As a result, all of the objects within the world gel together beautifully, appearing highly consistent. The key here is that Epic basically went back through the game with a fine-toothed comb and converted many surfaces and objects, including those that were previously just flat textures, to a full nanite mesh. The cladding on this house, for instance, is now fully modeled, as are the shingles adorning the roof. Individual bricks and stone are now used to create the game's floors and walls. They're more detailed than a simple texture. Even when zooming the camera all the way into a surface, you'll find loads of detail if you look for it. It's super impressive and brings a newfound level of complexity to the world design. Fortnite is a highly stylized game, of course, but the level of detail per object is so greatly increased, and thanks to Nanite, there's no more visible LOD transitions either, once the object is loaded into the scene anyways, which highlights one limitation with the system at this time currently. Essentially, due to memory and CPU cost, the game is only able to load and display a specific area around the player, so any area outside of the active sublevel is basically replaced with a single simplified HLOD mesh instead. As a result, those transition points between the HLOD and the active segments still show visible pop-in when moving through the world. That's why even with Nanite, pop-in remains a tricky problem to solve. But again, once the objects are actually loaded into the scene, you can zoom in and out as much as you like and everything remains consistent. This combination of both Nanite and Lumen then is highly potent, and Fortnite really demonstrates what's possible with the new engine, even when retrofitting an existing title. It's seriously impressive stuff, especially at 60 frames per second. These are not, however, the only new features. Another new component of Unreal 5.1 is the improved Temporal Super Resolution, or TSR feature. This effectively replaces the previous TAAU available in Unreal Engine and seeks to offer the sort of visual fidelity you might expect from more advanced solutions such as FSR2. The result is impressive, and we'll get to the actual rendering numbers on the console shortly, but suffice to say, the internal pixel counts are way below 4K, yet TSR produces a surprisingly 4K-like image. Epic has worked hard to improve TSR's speed and quality for this release of the engine, making it viable in a 60 frames per second game like Fortnite. The final major feature I wanted to touch on then is virtual shadow maps. This is a technique that produces unified high-quality shadow casting for both distance and near-field rendering. It accurately projects the shadows from detailed nanite meshes right down to individual blades of grass or even small stones, as you can see. Furthermore, shadows remain visible even at a long distance, increasing the overall cohesiveness of the map. It's a full replacement for other shadow casting techniques such as cascaded shadow maps, and avoids many of the drawbacks associated with those. Flipping back and forth here, it becomes a lot easier to see the benefits of using VSM in this case. Smaller details such as individual blades of grass all cast shadows with VSM. It makes a huge difference here, I think. It is not cheap, however, and on console there is definitely visible noise evident when examining the shadows up close, but it's still very impressive overall. Furthermore, it is possible to exclude certain objects from the virtual shadow map to increase performance, and this is something that one of the platforms, and I think you can guess which one, makes use of. We'll discuss that shortly. The key here is that all these techniques combine with other Unreal Engine 5 elements, such as the new large world partitioning feature, to create what amounts to a fantastic demonstration of the engine. It hints at big things to come from developers that have switched to Unreal, and also suggests that until now, few games have truly demonstrated what's really possible on this new generation of consoles. It's worth noting, by the way, that all current versions of Fortnite are utilizing Unreal Engine 5 by this point, a necessity I'd imagine for a live service game like this if you want to keep updates consistent between every platform. This includes the Nintendo Switch, of course, which, yes, it is using Unreal Engine 5 as well, just without the new visual features we've been discussing today. But that's basically an overview of what Unreal Engine 5.1 can deliver in a real shipping product. But what about the differences in Fortnite between each console? Well, to better understand this and also talk some PC, it's time to enter the Battaglia Zone.
Yes, John, here we are talking about the various console versions and PC and what it brings to the table, and I'm very glad to be here in this video.
Yes, indeed, Alex, because you have had a chance to speak with some fine folks at Epic, which is fantastic. So you have some additional answers to questions that we have here today. And of course, thus far in the video, we have examined what Lumen, Nanite, and all the other Unreal Engine 5 technologies bring to the table for the visuals. But of course, this is available across multiple platforms, and we have a good understanding now of how they differ. Both the consoles, which we'll start with, and then of course, your favorite, the PC. So, let's begin with those consoles then. So what are we looking at in terms of overall image quality differences?
Okay, so honestly, between the big 4K twins, as I'm now going to call them in this video right here, PS5 and Xbox Series X, there isn't too big of a difference. You're essentially looking at the exact same visual quality settings across the board, and they're both targeting PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. 4K using temporal super resolution that you talked about just earlier in this video, John, to make it look like a suitably 4K look, on your television set there or on your monitor. The internal resolution, though, like a lot of games that are using Unreal Engine 4 or 5, is actually purely dynamic, and then that is upscaled using their image reconstruction. The range that is allowed by Epic that I got from them in their interview by talking to them is all the way down to like 864p if something crazy were to happen. That's like the allowed range. And the top range that is allowed is 1836p. So it's a pretty large range to account for the fact that Fortnite is probably a rather dynamic game with a lot of crazy stuff that can happen. And speaking with Epic, they also said what the average resolution was in that range that I mentioned before, is in terms of percentage of 4K. And on PlayStation 5, it averages 55% on average, of 4K there. And on Xbox Series X, a little bit higher at 59%.
Hashtag power narrative.
I can't believe I just said that. Yeah, it is actually pretty small of a difference over what is similar content. But that just goes to show what Unreal Engine 5 is like, both now on these machines here. Series S.
Yeah, Series S is interesting because, and I'm very happy that this exists, because we've expressed a lot of concern over the viability of ray tracing-like features on the Series S.
Mm-hmm.
But Epic has managed to ship a 60 frames per second game on the console with Lumen and Nanite running, and it looks pretty darn impressive. But there's obvious cutbacks. Firstly, resolution. It tops out at 1080p internal, but can dip as low as 540p in busy scenes. And then, of course, they use TSR, which is...
Yeah.
They're doing TSR up to 1080p, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they're saying it averages around 73% of 1080p most of the time.
Yeah, and that's the axis resolution, by the way.
Correct,
so
yes.
Something above 720p, basically.
So that's actually pretty darn good, I'd say, for the console. But where we noticed more obvious cuts, though, is in terms of the actual visual quality.
Yes.
First and foremost, glossy reflections are gone.
Yeah, I mean, it makes
There's
sense.
no Lumen reflections here.
There's no Lumen reflections here, so it's all done with SSR, much like a last gen game would be, or the previous version of this might have been in like a higher quality mode. So that's a bit sad, but in the end, still SSR covers the bodies of water like at normal height pretty well. It looks okay.
Yeah, so basically, you'll see the Lumen reflections all over the world, though. Any sort of reflective surface will have this. And on Series S, it's essentially replaced with SSR. And it's most egregious with the water, I believe, because when you look down, obviously, the SSR just disappears, as always. But, the bigger brothers, all the other versions also combine SSR with Lumen reflections, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about with the PC version.
Yeah, but, for sure, yeah.
That is a difference. The other thing I noticed is that they seem to have adjusted. So I mentioned earlier that developers can exclude objects from the virtual shadow map for improving performance, and that's exactly what's been done on Series S here. That means things like blades of grass, small stones, and various other tiny objects are not contributing to the overall shadows on this console.
Bit of a shame, but it makes sense to hit 60 on what is essentially a very low-powered GPU in the year 2022.
Exactly.
You know?
The other thing, though, is that the fidelity of the lighting itself is reduced. There's more light leakage, less visible bounce lighting, and more. So it basically doesn't look quite as rich as the other versions, but it still looks pretty good, I'd say. And honestly, the cuts are obvious when you know where to look, but I would say, comparing them all, the Series S does a surprisingly good job, and it still produces a very attractive image.
Yeah, it gets the big stuff with GI, and that is probably the thing that makes this update look the way it does the most of the time.
Precisely. But of course, there's a lot more to this than just what the consoles offer. That's a very impressive aspect, but the PC version shows us more of what Unreal Engine 5 has in store for us. And one of the key features that it supports, hardware accelerated Lumen for ray traced reflections and GI, rather than the software solution which is used on the consoles. But as I noted, we have seen hardware Lumen on the consoles, but only at a much lower frame rate with the Matrix Awakens. This seems to be something that's done in order to hit 60 FPS. But what do you actually get then? Can you walk us through some of the differences?
Sure. I've made some side-by-side comparisons of the game using Epic software ray tracing on the left-hand side and Epic hardware ray tracing on the right-hand side. And one of the first things that is most noticeable is just more accurate reflections overall. For example, hardware RT, like you're seeing in this scene here on the right-hand side, can show things like character models in them. So you can see my character reflected in this mirror here, something that is missing in the software view, which only can use SSR for such things. And if you notice as well, background detail in the shot is a little bit better looking due to the fact that it's using higher resolution geometry than, just those SDFs. as a part of more accurate shadows, like objects tend to have less parts of their reflection covered just by screen space, which you see in the software mode. So like in this shot here of this trailer, we can see that the awning, on the side of the trailer, this colored awning on the side of the trailer, you can see its reflection there in the hardware RT view, but it's not there in the software RT view. Another thing that you'll see, and I think this is probably maybe seen best in our 4-way footage, is that there's more accurate GI and reflections at a distance versus software RT at times. And you can see that typically on bodies of water where things at a distance are either not there in software RT or they're much higher quality in the hardware RT mode. So that's another thing, but it's honestly less visible than the stuff usually up close. So as I mentioned earlier, like moving objects and deformable objects are part of the GI equation with hardware RT. So the things like moving things like this car in this shot here, as well as the player model in front of the car, contribute to GI out of screen space. So that's why there's this darkened shadow underneath the car here, because it's being lit up from the sky above and there's a shadow underneath it. Something that can't be captured in the software RT mode. And in general, I would say one of the larger things that you'll see also up close is that there's just less light leaking and less, I would say, maybe like fizzle in the lighting itself usually. So look at this shot in the trailer here. Once again, one of these trailers where it's at nighttime and I'm moving around here on the floor. And you can see, for one, like my character's reflected in the television, but inside the trailer, it's really dark with hardware RT on, but it's kind of weirdly bright with software RT. That's just because light is coming from the outside and the walls of this trailer are very thin. It makes sense why it's happening, but it's just one of the differences you'll see. As I say that, there's some really cool stuff that it adds and brings to the table. It's still kind of imperfect because hardware Lumen, just like software Lumen, is trying to run in real time and be very scalable. And so it doesn't like scale up in quality super high always. So there's some imperfections. Like here in this shot here, we can still see software Lumen on the left, hardware Lumen on the right, underneath the stairwell here, that both still have light leaking in from the outside. There's less in the hardware RT mode, but it's still pretty obvious in scenes when it happens. There's also some weird regressions I saw where, like inside the castle in this shot here, software RT actually has less light leaking than hardware RT, which is a bit unexpected. I'm not sure why it's happening. But it's definitely something that you can see occasionally inside this castle here. Some other imperfections that a little bit surprised me is that Unreal Engine 5.1 shipped with transparency reflections that I made a screenshot of that you can see here in the Matrix Awakens demo on PC, exported out there with 5.1, and they add a lot to glass surfaces. And another thing that is a little bit imperfect still, obviously, but once again, this is targeting high performance, is that reflections use the surface cache all over. So that means at a distance, sometimes when you look at water reflections, like I was showing off earlier, and they're not in screen space, they can look a little bit weirdly black. Or also like the character in the shot I showed in the mirror earlier on PC with hardware ray tracing on. Like you can see him in the mirror at least, but he's also like missing shading on the front half of his body. So it just looks a little awkward.
And for those wondering, actually, here I can actually show the surface cache from within the Unreal Engine editor.
Oh, yeah.
So you get a better visualization of what that actually looks like. So this is what it's tracing into, which is why, it doesn't look nearly as nice. Why they layer the screen space reflections on top of it.
Precisely.
Obviously, things could be improved, but for performance reasons, I think this is the solution they're using.
Yeah. And like we're saying, just like performance, like they're trying to keep this up at high quality on PC, as well as 1080, at some reasonable 60 FPS there on consoles, which is great. So let's get over to talk about performance.
Yeah, so briefly on the console side. So this is a curious one. We all played on the different consoles together and found that in our testing through several matches, the game was basically just locked 60 frames per second.
Yes.
However, I have doubts that it's always locked, and based on just reading various conversations, I suspect it's possible to dip the frame rate, but we were never placed in a situation where that occurred.
Yeah, right.
So my guess is that by and large, console users will probably have a very smooth experience. But if, again, with these big multiplayer games, you really can't say with certainty that it doesn't dip, and I'm sure each of them exhibits some kind of drops at some point.
Yep.
I can't say how severe they are or how frequent they are, but it doesn't seem like a big issue is what I'm saying, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, the fact that we played, several matches together without issue says that it must be pretty good overall.
And I've continued to play as well on my own, and same thing, there's really no issues with the performance that I've encountered.
Yep.
Which is great. Also to note, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to see these improvements on the console versions, you must disable the 120 FPS mode.
Yep.
These do not apply to that mode at all, so you will not receive any of the visual improvements. So turn that off if you want to experience the full brunt of the engine. So that's the console performance in general. Nothing too exciting. The news is great. But PC I was curious about, because we actually did an experiment here where on our first run, Alex, you started up the game for the first time
Ever.
and jumped right into a match with us, which means we could analyze this for any sort of PSO stuttering.
Yeah.
And what did you find?
So there is still shader compilation stutter in this Chapter 4 version of Fortnite, Unreal Engine 5.1. It is taking advantage of the new asynchronous shader compilation that is, as a part of Unreal Engine 5.1. And it is also combining that with the old method too of a manual compilation that happens when you're in the menu, for example. So I let it, run in the menu, and it was, that asynchronous stuff was going on in game, but it was still struggling. It was still had stutters, and it would happen, for example, like when I would fly down into the map from above in the bus. It happened, like in the initial part when everyone's partying before the game starts. And as you're just kind of like going around in the game, if you get in a car, for example, and drive around, as you're seeing the footage here of me following John's perspective in the player spectator mode, that you can see that there are kind of large stutters there when you're going around the map. And also technically, if you were to see new players, they would also maybe, depending upon their skin, also cause a shader stutter, which is not very good at all. Actually, it's kind of like a competitive disadvantage at that point.
Yeah, that's the thing with this, right? And it's surprising to me that even at this point you don't hear a lot of others talking about this, because competitive Fortnite is a big deal. But every time your driver changes or you swap out GPUs, even if you're playing at 3 to 400 frames per second at low detail, you're still going to get shader comp stutter.
Yeah, you really will.
And there's just no way around it. And
Yeah.
it's really, we understand now why it happens, right? And you actually do have some news on this, which is great. But it's amazing to me that their Halo product here is still shipping with this problem sort of at the forefront.
Yeah, it really
is. Because it sets a bad precedent for all other Unreal-based games, and it's a precedent that we've seen over and over and over again with like basically one exception.
Yeah.
Which is absurd at this point.
Yeah.
It's bad. But you actually did ask the VP of Engineering at Epic Games, Nick Penwarden, directly about stutter struggle.
Yeah, I
and
did.
he did have some interesting answers for us.
Yeah, so like one thing to be said is that it is way better than it was before. Technically,
Yes.
the old client would have had way more stuttering than what we've showed you in this video. It's still not great here, honestly, though, because I'm showing it on like a Core i9 1200K. Whoa, it's huge. But when talking with Nick, which was a really awesome, pleasant conversation, when we got to the topic of PSO compilation stutters, he mentioned essentially that what we're looking at here in 5.1 is that asynchronous shader compilation, but it's technically still imperfect in a couple of ways. For example, like it is not necessarily taking into account the fact, like the way characters are streamed in might be different than like the rest of the world. So their PSO compilation is not necessarily being taken care of in an optimal way at the moment. Another thing that was mentioned was that the game is now using that like world partitioning system to make this larger world perform better and stream in better with Nanite. As a part of this, when you're moving around in the car that I showed off earlier, where it stutter struggled, is that you can essentially outrace the list of PSOs that are being compiled asynchronously in the background when you go into a new area that is being streamed in. And there's currently like no priority there to say don't stutter at this moment and instead show the object a little bit later. So it's going to stutter. So these are things that are not currently a part of the 5.1 version of the asynchronous shader compilation, but they are looking in the future, for example, for something like 5.2 and other updates to Fortnite, like, iterative updates to Chapter 4 in the future, to adding in a different and more tailored version of this asynchronous shader compilation to make sure that it doesn't happen. Because I actually do think they are taking it super seriously now based upon the conversation.
That's
so
fantastic.
Yeah, that is really good news to hear. Obviously, that's something we'll have to test ourselves in the future, but right now there is still shader compilation stutter here on PC. Yeah.
And hopefully these changes filter down to the developers.
Yes.
And they are essentially willing to implement them fully.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key here. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
I think you'll ensure that everyone knows one way or the other.
I definitely will, John. Oh my gosh.
But that's kind of it for this one, right? So I think by now, hopefully, you can see why we're actually sitting here excited about Fortnite, which is not something I thought I would be saying.
Yeah, right.
But these new additions, they're very, very impressive, and it alleviates a lot of concerns we had about the future of this engine and many of the developers that were adopting it, right? Like, there's still things that bear concern, but by and large, it does seem to be shaping up, and it does seem to be an option for developers that still want to target higher frame rates while offering these new features.
For sure,
and that's fantastic. And one of the big takeaways for me, though, is that, especially with this art style, but I can imagine it with others, is that this sort of opens the doors for potentially less expensive development. Specifically, I can't imagine an indie project, right? You can't build assets necessarily with the huge amount of detail that we've seen in some of the AAA games.
No.
Not without a support studio, not without tons of artists that very expensive. But by harnessing the power of something like Lumen, you can create environments that can be very geometrically simple. They don't need to be anything special. I mean, even just something like a Quake map in terms of geometry. You get that, you combine this with Lumen GI and reflections, and you can create something that looks beautiful with far fewer resources than before. And the lighting is just done for you via this system. No more baking things out to see how they look. You can just build wonderful, beautiful maps and just rely on these tools to create it. And I want to see what is done with this going forward.
Yes,
and
definitely.
I have a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, I do too. Low poly art style with great lighting. Sounds cool.
Yeah, give me virtua racing, but like ray traced.
Why not?
That's what I want to see. I think that would look great. But that's going to do it for this overall video. Hopefully you enjoyed both parts 1 and 2 and have gained an appreciation for this sort of technology. And hopefully you can start to understand why we've been so excited about all things ray tracing. Even the software version.
Oh, yeah.
So this is fantastic stuff. It looks amazing. And we'll be looking forward to games coming forward. Thank you for joining me on this one, Alex, to share your knowledge with that recent chat.
Yeah, of course, John. I love talking with you as always.
And with that, we have our very own Victory Royale with cheese.